Since the dawn of time. Alright, that might be an exaggeration, but for a while, many people, myself included, have been clamoring for a re-release of Marvel vs. Capcom 2. It was stuck on old hardware for years, and once it got re-released on Xbox 360 and PS3, it didn't really last very long. Fast forward to now, where we don't just have Marvel vs. Capcom 2, but any and every game that can be considered part of that series, or even like closely associated with it, is now playable with the Marvel vs. Capcom Fighting Collection Arcade Classics, which for brevity's sake, I'll just be referring to it as the Marvel vs. Capcom Collection because what is that name? And I am beyond overjoyed to say that for a Marvel vs. Capcom Collection, this is pretty much everything I could have possibly asked for. But let's talk about it. Hi guys, EPX here, reviewing today the Marvel vs. Capcom Collection, or whatever the overly long title is. Now before we get started, you know what to do. Be sure to like this video, subscribe, hit the bell, and leave a comment, or I will unleash an air combo on you. Starting off with the good, in terms of game selection, the Marvel vs. Capcom Collection is probably Capcom's best collection, and they've done a lot. 7 games that have received little to absolutely no re-releases ever, and the ones that have been re-released were done in ways where it's really hard to go back to now. Because this is a collection of games, I'm going to go over each game individually. Starting with X-Men Children of the Atom, this was the first fighting game that Capcom developed with Marvel characters. It's a very solid fighter with some great sprite work that still holds up very well today, and still plays very well too. Then we got Marvel Superheroes. If X-Men Children of the Atom, or CODA as I'll be referring to as for brevity's sake, was Capcom's first attempt at a Marvel fighting game with X-Men characters, Marvel Superheroes expands to just Marvel. And by expands, it doesn't necessarily really actually expand, it more replaces many X-Men characters with Marvel characters like Iron Man, Hulk, Captain America, and Spider-Man. While not as good as CODA, I think it is still a very solid fighting game. In a vacuum, characters like Shuma Gorath and Blackheart being in the game might seem a little odd, as I'm sure if you're not familiar with these games and maybe you just, I don't know, seen the movies, the Marvel movies, you probably just responded with a resounding who? But they are some pretty cool deep cuts that remained in the series for quite a bit. And this series actually evolves into a crossover with X-Men vs. Street Fighter. Now I will say this is a collection of the arcade versions of these games, and in some cases there are some issues with that I'll get into later, but in the case of X-Men vs. Street Fighter, perfect. The arcade version is the perfect version of this, I feel, often forgotten game. And in terms of gameplay, X-Men vs. Street Fighter might be one of the better games in this collection. Then after X-Men vs. Street Fighter, we got Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, where it's a similar jump from CODA to MSH, but instead with Street Fighter characters. This game isn't as good as X-Men vs. Street Fighter, but I still think it's a solid game. Not to mention, the Japanese version of the game has a weird inclusion being Norimaru, who is a character based on the Japanese comedian Noritake Kanashi. There's a bit of a story behind how he ended up in this game that I'm not going to go into, go look it up. But I didn't think he would actually be included in this collection because of the rights and likenesses and all that, but lo and behold, if you switch the game to Japanese, he's playable. After Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, we finally get Marvel vs. Capcom. Despite having a small roster, I'd say the first Marvel vs. Capcom is very balanced in terms of its roster and plays very well. And then of course, probably the main selling point of this collection, we get Marvel vs. Capcom 2. To many, one of, if not the greatest fighting game of all time. And while I don't 100% agree with that, the roster on display is unbelievable. They got pretty much every character from the previous crossover games playable in this, along with many more. The music has also stood the test of time and is absolutely fire. And while the roster might not be the most balanced and some characters might be questionable, like why do we have 2 Wolverines and what is Servbot doing here? But still, MVC2 is without a doubt the best game in this collection. But I skipped a game because it is certainly an outlier in the collection, and that's The Punisher. Unlike the rest of the collection, which contains fighting games, The Punisher is a 2D side-scrolling beat-em-up like Final Fight or Streets of Rage. Despite being the outlier, The Punisher is definitely the most important game in this collection, as it predates all the other games, meaning that this is where the Marvel and Capcom partnership started. Despite that, the Punisher has yet to be a playable character in an MVC game. That's odd. But yeah, that's the collection. 7 games that are all very solid, some much better than others, but the fact that they are all playable, again, alone, makes it worth it. And another thing I like is how the collection handles secret characters. You can turn them on or off, so like Marvel vs. Capcom 2, for example, has many unlockable characters, but in the collection, all the characters are unlocked from the get-go. However, you have the option to make it so that you unlock the characters. So Capcom thought of the people who would want to unlock characters and people who wouldn't, which I think is really cool. Another thing that this collection has is online. You can compete with players in the fighting games, and the online works really well. I did not receive any lag or anything like that. I do have one issue with the online that I'll talk about later, but the online works very well. Additionally, with collection games, you get them to play the games in the collection. But what I think goes a very long way is the love and attention put into like the UI, the menus, and the music when not playing the games. And I'm happy to say that the Marvel vs. Capcom collection does not disappoint. The second you boot up this game, it hits you with a pretty fire menu theme, and the UI is nice as well. Another thing I love about collection games is the museum, where you get to see some artwork or concept art, or maybe there's like a music player, and the MVC collection has all of that. I genuinely got lost looking through the artwork and seeing how some characters in some games originally started, and that's very interesting. And of course, the music player. The whole franchise has one of the best soundtracks in video games in my personal opinion, so going through each game and listening to every character's theme song is a nice touch. Simply put, the Marvel vs. Capcom collection is just stellar.
Mega Man, win!
Moving on to the mixed aspects, these are things that I can go either way on, or maybe I'm just not quite sure if they go in the good or the bad, so they go in the mixed. Starting off, I mentioned how this game is titled Arcade Classics, meaning it's the arcade versions of each game, and while that is perfect for some games, not entirely for others. For example, the best version of Marvel vs. Capcom 2 is not the arcade version, it's the Dreamcast version. That version has many quality of life improvements over the arcade version, but the arcade version is the version that is playable. It's not like the arcade version sucks, it's two different versions that are still amazing. They just went with the slightly less amazing version. But that issue kind of extends a bit, you know? In the PS1 version of Marvel Superheroes vs. Capcom, Apocalypse is a hidden character that you can play as, but he's not playable in the arcade version. Same with Onslaught in Marvel vs. Capcom. He's a hidden playable character in the PS1 version of the game, but not in the arcade version, and since this is a collection of the arcade versions, Apocalypse and Onslaught, respectively, are not playable in this collection, which is disappointing. But overall, not a deal breaker by any means. Moving on to the bad, there are two issues. One is that there is no crossplay. Ultimately, I don't think this is that bad, so it's not a major issue, but it is a feature that should be here. And the other issue, which bothers me a lot more, is the fact that you only get one save slot. And I mean one save slot for the whole collection. Most collection games let you create a save point so you can leave and play a different game, and you get one save slot for each game. But the MVC collection doesn't really do that. How it works is, let's just say you're playing MVC 2, but you want to put it down for a second and play the Punisher. So you create a save point in MVC 2 and you start playing the Punisher. But then, after a few stages, you want to put the Punisher down and play, say, X-Men vs. Street Fighter. Naturally, you want to create a save for the Punisher, but that would overwrite your save for MVC 2. So you can't have a save slot running for more than one game at a time. That is definitely frustrating. Overall, despite some issues I have, Marvel vs. Capcom Fighting Collection Arcade Classics is more than worth your buck. It takes 7 games that have received little to no re-release ever, and puts them all in one package. This whole thing felt like a pipe dream for the longest time, so to finally get it, and for it to be well worth the wait, I think that is a miracle. Critically, I can't give the MVC collection a 10, because the whole save slot thing does hold it back for me, but this is well worth your buck. 7 games that are a hell of a lot of fun. And honestly, MVC 2 alone would have been worth it, but the fact that they threw in 6 more games and made it a whole MVC collection, I think is stellar. So, if I can't give it a 10, I will give the Marvel vs. Capcom collection a 9.5 out of 10. So that's my review for the MVC collection, or the Marvel vs. Capcom Fighting Collection Arcade Classics. I just call it the Marvel vs. Capcom collection, I don't understand, but either way, what do you guys think? Do you guys like this game, not like this game? Have you guys got the game, not got the game? If you don't have the game, do you guys want to play it, not want to play it? Anything about the game, let me know down below. Anyways, if you like the video, comment, subscribe, or I will unleash an air combo on you.